The first thing I saw was the shimmer of Christmas lights blurring through falling snow, and the first thing I heard was a carol drifting from a warm, perfect house that had locked a child outside. My granddaughter's breath fanned the frosted air, her pink coat dusted white, her hands tucked beneath her arms the way small animals curl to save heat. 8 years old, shivering on Christmas Eve, waiting for permission to be human again. I was 68, called Dot, by everyone who loved me, and I had taught 100 students to read before arthritis settled in my knuckles. But nothing in a classroom prepared me for the sight of my little Emma blinking up at me as if she were the one who had done something wrong. 2 hours earlier at about 4 p.m., I had pulled into my son Kevin's driveway, my trunk stacked with presents and cinnamon roll ingredients I could measure by memory. The house glittered the way my daughter-in-law Sarah liked to present it, wreaths perfectly aligned bows, sitting at attention, not a strand of tinsel out of place. When she opened the door in a cream sweater that looked like it had its own bodyguard, she said, "Dorothy, not Mom," as if my name were a flavor she regretted choosing. Perfume and expensive candles fought in the foyer. Someplace deeper in the house, silence waited with a knife. I asked for Emma, picturing a sprint into my arms and the smack of her happy cheeks against mine. "She's learning consequences," Sarah said, smoothing hair that had never met a stray day. A Waterford ornament she added completely destroyed. She said it the way an empress might say uprising. I found Kevin in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a phone for a spine. "Sarah's handling it," he told me, and I felt the old knot in my stomach harden into ice. At the back door, snow tapped the glass like a polite guest. When I opened it, the wind introduced me to the truth. Emma huddled against patio furniture, eyelashes jeweled with flakes, cheeks red and raw. "Grandma Dot," she whispered, "Mommy says I can come in when I learn my lesson." The lesson, it turned out, was gravity. She had tried to peek at a present and bumped the tree. An ornament fell and shattered. She had apologized. Sarah had moved the courtroom outdoors. I brought Emma inside, my voice calm, because rage can't wrap a child in a towel. Warm bath, I told Kevin, because sometimes you give a man orders to remind him he is still someone's father. He looked from me to his wife and made the kind of helpless sound a deer might make if it could blush. "Maybe we should all just calm down," he said. "Calm down," I replied, and felt something old and steady spark awake. "It's 28 degrees. Sarah's smile thinned. "That ornament," she said, "cost $400. I thought about price tags and children and how easily adults confuse the worth of things for the worth of people. "She is 8, I said. "Which is old enough to be careful," Sarah answered, "if someone teaches her." The word teach had never sounded more like punish. Upstairs, steam blurred the mirror while I eased Emma out of her damp clothes and tested the bath with my elbow, the way I had when my husband Harold was alive and our boy was small. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "No, sweetheart," I said, pressing a kiss to hair that smelled of cold. Sometimes grown-ups forget what matters. I left her with cocoa and a fluff of towels like a nest and called my oldest friend from the hallway. "Maggie listens the way the ocean listens to a shoreline." "Dot," she said after I unloaded the whole storm that isn't discipline. "That's abuse." She told me what any good woman who knows how the world works would say: write things down, take pictures, record details, protect your access to the child like it's oxygen. Back downstairs, the living room glowed magazine beautiful around a vacancy where love should have been. Sarah sat by the fire with her chin lifted the way people do when they mistake control for wisdom. "Don't undermine my authority in my home," she said. "Your authority." I kept my eyes on hers because bullies hate the mirror. "Do you love that little girl, or is she another surface you expect to gleam?" Kevin set his glass down with a clink that sounded like punctuation on a sentence he didn't finish. Sarah spoke about structure, about standards, about a world full of brats. She spoke as if 8-year-olds were executives in need of quarterly performance reviews. I looked at my son and waited for the boy who once stood up to playground tyrants to stand up again. He studied his phone like it knew better. The next morning, I watched Christmas turned into a military drill. Emma waited for permission to touch, to open, to breathe. Each scrap of paper was removed before joy could stick to it. Thank you notes were drafted like documents of surrender. The house was immaculate, but the air felt vacuum-sealed. When Sarah went upstairs to freshen, I found Kevin in the kitchen loading the dishwasher with the precision of a man who has learned that compliance buys a quiet evening. "When did you stop being her father?" I asked. Color rose in his face. He parroted words about partnership and systems, then faltered when I asked which California college had granted Sarah her child development expertise. He couldn't name one. The question hung in the room, and I recognized the echo of my own fear. What if everything we had accepted as expertise was theater? At the park that afternoon, Emma sat at the top of the slide and looked over her shoulder for permission that wasn't coming. I took photos of small, telling things. The fixed smile, the careful hands, the way she chewed her lip instead of laughing from her belly. Back at the house, I offered pizza to test the shape of her world. Sarah said children did not have favorites. Nutrition and compliance were the only flavors she recognized. Emma's eyes flicked toward a delivery magnet on the fridge, then dropped as if even wanting were a violation. That night, while Sarah complained to her sister about how difficult everyone made her flawless life, I stepped into her office. The bottom drawer held a folder labeled with Emma's name and the cold promise that someone had been keeping score. Infractions cataloged like crimes, clinical language for ordinary childhood, a note about more intensive strategies, a line about limiting Kevin's influence. My hands shook while I photographed each page. When Sarah found me there, she closed the door gently and let the mask fall. Her voice belonged to a winter road, hard-polished and treacherous. She had not married into a family. She had acquired a laboratory. I told her I was looking for the truth and believed in that moment I had found enough to fight. She smiled the way chess players smile when they have already mapped the board. "Dorothy." She said, "I think it's time you went home." Kevin walked me to my car as if escorting a trespasser. But there is a difference between leaving and retreating. On the drive, I let the radio hum and counted heartbeats until my anger cooled into resolve. At my kitchen table after 9 p.m., I spread out photographs, scribbled notes, timestamps, phone logs, and the shaky knowledge that a grandmother's love would have to learn the law. Somewhere between the steam of my midnight tea and the memory of Emma's small, cold hand, a plan began to form. By 7 a.m., resolve had replaced the tremor in my hands. I called Maggie and Patricia in quick succession, then pulled on a sweater and went hunting through old files for the kind of meticulousness grief had not stolen from me. I had copies of emails about school conferences Sarah had orchestrated, like press briefings, texts, where she redefined accidents as infractions. A photograph from last spring of Emma standing on the edge of the soccer field instead of playing because dirt on her socks taught carelessness. I made a list with dates and times the way teachers do when a pattern needs proof. At 9:30 a.m., Patricia picked up and listened to everything. She talked about thresholds and affidavits, about the difference between a bad parent and a dangerous one, about courts that prefer calm facts to righteous rage. "Document. She said. "Keep seeing, keep writing, and protect your access. If she senses you're gathering, she may slam doors you can't reopen quickly." The next move required sunlight. At 11 a.m., I texted Kevin 3 questions that could not be dodged by theory. When did Emma last laugh with you? When did she last choose a meal? When did she last sleep without fear of being scolded for a blanket crease? His reply came an hour later, a lonely confession in 3 single words. I can't remember. At 2 p.m., he stood on my porch looking like a man who had misplaced himself. I brewed coffee and set out a plate of cookies, because sometimes a kitchen is still a sanctuary. He spoke in fragments at first, as if each sentence had to step past 5 years of second-guessing. Emma used to hum while he chopped vegetables. She used to name clouds. She used to say goodnight to the moon. Somewhere along the way, humming became noise clouds, became distractions. The moon became an excuse to delay lights out. I showed him the photos from the park, the glance over the shoulder, the clenched jaw on a slide meant for laughter, and watched realization pull his face taut. "She used to sing," he whispered, as if the memory itself were contraband. Before Sarah, she sang all the time. It was time to tug at the thread of credentials Sarah had wrapped herself in like armor. I opened my laptop and walked him through it step by careful step. The list of accredited programs in the city she named the registrar offices that had no record of any Sarah with her maiden or married names in child development across those years, the defunct counseling center, whose website had been a graveyard for a decade. He stared at the screen as if numbers were beginning to reorganize into letters he could finally read. She sounded so certain, he said. She always sounds so certain. I touched his wrist the way I had when he was little and feverish. Confidence is not proof, I said. Love is not evidence. But this, I tapped the spreadsheet, is a start. We planned in the quiet way people plan around someone who listens through walls. He would begin small and steady. When Emma hummed, he would praise it. When Sarah lined peas in perfection on a plate, he would tell Emma she could eat them in any order her heart pleased. When bedtime became a drill, he would shift the ritual back towards story and warmth, and he would record everything dates words, the look in a child's eyes when she asked permission to smile. At 4 p.m., he left with a thumb drive of files and a spine less likely to fold. The first small victory arrived the very next afternoon at 3:15 p.m. when Kevin collected Emma from school and drove straight to my house. She entered like a deer stepping onto ice, beautiful, trembling, ready to leap at the crack of a stern voice. I asked if she wanted cookies. She looked at Kevin as if the answer might be a trap. He told her yes, and she took a bite. The way a child raised on contingency eats sweetness, slowly reverent, braced for loss. "Are you happy at home?" I asked gently. Tears filmed her eyes, and she tried to be brave because she has learned that adults prize composure. "I try to be good," she said, and I felt something tear behind my ribs. Kevin knelt beside her and conjured a kitchen where music once lived. "Do you remember dancing while I made dinner?" She nodded a tiny light. He promised her they'd dance that night. She giggled a sound like a match in a dark room. At 4 p.m., Sarah's name lit my phone. Her voice could have frosted glass. She demanded their return, pivoted to accusation when I said no, wrapped herself in words like interference and therapeutic progress, and hung up with a promise that sounded a lot like a threat. The next morning at 9 a.m., a process server handed me a restraining order on my own porch. It painted me as a destabilizing force who had undermined carefully designed protocols for a troubled child. The lies were polished, but their sheen revealed something useful. Sarah had described her methods in detail, the language of experiments where affection should live. "This is a gift," Patricia said at 11:30 a.m., after I scanned her the document. She has laid out her blueprint. Courts do not like children treated as projects. Meanwhile, Kevin's small acts of rebellion attracted swift retaliation. By 6 p.m. that day, Sarah criticized the way he tied Emma's shoelaces. At 7 p.m., she rewrote his bedtime story into a lecture on efficiency. Before 8 p.m., she had told Emma that humming proved she lacked self-control, and told Kevin that his nostalgia made him weak. He wrote it all down. He took photos of the charts taped to the refrigerator, the schedules with bathroom breaks timed like departures, the checklist of acceptable phrases Emma was allowed to use when asking for things. He called me from his car at 8:45 p.m., voice low the way men speak when they think even the dashboard might report them. On Sarah's computer, he had found folders, articles about compliance essays, about breaking will screenshots from forums where a small circle of women traded strategies for molding families like clay. Some posts were mundane, some were chilling, and too many wore a smile over cruelty. Copy everything I told him. And then, son, it's time to bring this into the light. 3 days later at 10 a.m., Patricia filed a counter-petition. We asked for a child welfare evaluation for the court to consider coercive control as the context for every protocol for temporary adjustments to custody until someone with credentials that actually existed could assess the danger. The waiting began the slow machinery of calendars and clerks, the drip of days where Emma tiptoed and Kevin practiced being steel wrapped in gentleness. I spent the time wisely printing photographs, organizing logs, writing a statement that told the truth without venom, because judges know the difference between a vendetta and a rescue. At 6 p.m. after dinner, I practiced reading it aloud to my living room, so that when the moment came, I would not let my voice shake. On the fourth evening of our quiet campaign, just after 7 p.m., Kevin and Emma returned to my house for an hour that tasted like what childhood should. We danced in the kitchen while noodles boiled. Emma chose sauce and spoon and song. I caught Kevin looking at his daughter as if he were seeing a sunrise he had assumed would never return. My phone buzzed with a new email, a court date, 2 weeks out, 9 a.m. sharp. I printed it and slid it beneath a magnet shaped like a bluebird. When I looked up, Emma was twirling hair, flashing in the light, and Kevin was laughing softly, the sound of a father remembering his own name. The morning of the custody hearing dawned gray, the kind of sky that pressed down on rooftops like a warning. I dressed with the steadiness of ritual navy jacket pearl earrings Harold had given me on our 40th anniversary, a notebook in my bag, thick with proof. By 8 a.m., Kevin and I stood on courthouse steps that smelled faintly of rain and nerves. He looked pale but determined, clutching a folder of printouts he had spent nights compiling while Emma slept. At 9 a.m. sharp, we entered a room where lives are rearranged with words and paper. Sarah arrived in a designer suit that made her look as if she had stepped out of one of the lifestyle magazines she adored. Her hair was perfect. Her smile controlled her arm, burdened with a binder of so-called evidence. She greeted the judge with the confidence of someone who believed order and image were the same as truth. For a moment, I almost admired her performance. Then I remembered Emma's small voice asking permission to eat a cookie. The judge began by reviewing Sarah's restraining order. Each line painted me as a disruptive meddler who encouraged defiance and undermined parental authority. But the more the judge read aloud, the more the room shifted. The phrases Sarah had chosen, systematic behavioral modification, controlled environmental stimuli, elimination of positive reinforcement, did not sound like the vocabulary of a loving parent. They sounded clinical, cold, and deeply troubling. "Mrs. Williams," the judge said, peering over glasses, "can you explain why you describe your stepdaughter's natural childhood behaviors as infractions requiring corrective measures?" Sarah crossed her legs and spoke in a voice dripping composure. "Emma displayed numerous problematic behaviors when I joined the family. Excessive crying tantrums, refusal to follow basic instructions, these required intervention." "How old was the child at that time?" the judge asked. 3, Sarah replied briskly as though the number absolved her. The judge frowned. "At 3 years old, those are developmentally appropriate behaviors. That is how children learn." Patricia, calm as a surgeon, presented the files Kevin had retrieved. Screenshots of Sarah's online posts where she spoke of children as tyrants, to be broken instructions she had saved from forums filled with women who glorified control. She presented the evidence of Sarah's fabricated credentials, no record of her degrees, no evidence of employment history, nothing but smoke and mirrors wrapped in confidence. Then she laid out the photographs Emma at the park, glancing over her shoulder before sliding her face lined with worry no 8-year-old should carry. Kevin testified next. His voice shook at first, but then steadied as he described the way Emma had changed under Sarah's rules. How she no longer laughed without permission, how bedtime stories had become lectures, how even shoelaces were subject to judgment. He admitted his own failures, his silence, his wine glass clutched like a shield, but his honesty rang louder than Sarah's polished defense. When Emma was called to meet privately with the court-appointed child advocate, I prayed harder than I had in years. At 11:30 a.m., she emerged, her small hands clasped in her lap, but there was a new light in her eyes. She glanced at me and smiled, tentative but real. By noon, the ruling was delivered. Temporary custody to Kevin. Supervised visitation for Sarah contingent upon her completing parenting classes and undergoing psychological evaluation. The restraining order against me was dismissed with prejudice, the judge remarking that grandparental concern was not only understandable, but warranted. The courtroom emptied, but Sarah's glare lingered like frostbite. She had lost control, and though she masked it with poise, her clenched jaw betrayed her. Kevin exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for 5 years. I placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Now the real work begins." That evening we returned to my house. I made macaroni and cheese, Emma's long-forbidden favorite, and set it on the table with a flourish as though it were a feast. She took a bite, then another, then began humming through her mouthful. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "can we dance while Grandma cooks?" Kevin's eyes filled with tears. "We can dance whenever you want," he said. And just like that, my kitchen became a ballroom noodles, boiling like a drumbeat, while father and daughter twirled laughter, spilling into corners where sorrow had lived too long. In the weeks that followed, Sarah attempted appeals, but each collapsed under the weight of her own words and the cold clarity of the psychological evaluation. Her obsession with control, her lack of empathy, her fabricated expertise, all of it painted her as unfit for motherhood. By the end of 6 months, Kevin was granted full custody. Sarah disappeared into the background she had always tried to stage manage, leaving no forwarding address. Emma turned 9 that summer. She danced barefoot on my lawn, sang loudly in the kitchen, asked a million questions with the unrestrained curiosity of a child finally free. Kevin rebuilt slowly, rediscovering his own voice as a father learning that love does not look like compliance, that strength can be gentler than rules. One evening, as the sun fell behind the oak tree in my backyard, Emma curled up beside me and asked Grandma, "Am I normal now?" I kissed the crown of her head and said, "Sweetheart, you were always normal. You were always perfect. The only thing wrong was the way someone tried to convince you otherwise. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud. They're not courtroom rulings or signatures on paper. They're the soft giggles of a child rediscovering joy, the steady gaze of a son remembering who he is, the warmth of a kitchen where dancing is allowed again. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't punishment, it's watching someone you love bloom back into themselves." If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your stories matter too, and your voice might be the one that helps someone else see what they've been too afraid to name.